Uh, and I am very thankful to all of you to make time. Some of you must be having classes during the day, and many of you said that you could not join because of that and are looking forward to a recording. We will do that. Before I proceed any further, I think we'll share a bit of netiquettes with you, and then we'll go on to the main program session for the day. Our Zoom manager, Suleiman, will talk about the netiquettes. He's also the manager at CLT, and he's the Zoom host for now.
Good morning, everyone. Let us go through the netiquettes before we start today's session. You have to rename yourself according to this format. First comes the brief institution name, then the brief department name, and then your full name. Please see this example. And this is how you have to rename yourself. Right-click your own video and then select rename. If you're facing a bandwidth issue, please keep your video turned off. We will keep you all muted during the session. If you have a question to ask, please write it in the chat box. If allowed to speak, host will ask you to unmute yourself. You will get a notification on your screen to unmute. Please proceed accordingly. While speaking, please be mindful of the time. Keep your comments brief and to the point, and be respectful of others' opinion. We are also recording this session. This note is for the FCCU faculty. To get a certificate of participation, please ensure your institution, department, and full name is clearly listed. We will not be able to issue the certificate if the instructions are not properly followed. Thank you.
Thank you, Suleiman. And for those of you that are not from FCC, I am Ruxana Zia. I head the Center of Learning and Teaching. And today is a very exciting day for us because, and I must say how I came across Dr. Brian Beatty. I was preparing for our fall, retreat. And while looking through the latest resources that came across, his name came up as one of the pioneers. And so I reached out to him and he very kindly agreed. Thank you so much, Dr. Beatty. But I will first of all, our Vice Rector, Dr. Trimble, was very excited to hear that you had agreed to join, and he personally wanted to welcome you. So Dr. Trimble, over to you.
Good morning all and welcome to this session. I want to say a special welcome to Brian Beatty. Thank you for agreeing to be participating in this. We really appreciate it. I'd like to introduce Dr. Beatty to each of you. Dr. Beatty is the Associate Professor of Instructional Technologies at the Department of Equity, Leadership Studies, and Instructional Technologies at San Francisco State University. He has a BS in Electrical Engineering, an MA in Instructional Technologies, and a PhD in Instructional Systems Technology from Indiana University, Bloomington. His specific interests include social interaction in online learning, flipped classrooms, hybrid flexible learning, and he has a specific influence in student-directed hybrid approach. I think this would be very helpful for us as we are in this particular mode of instruction at FC College University. Dr. Beatty has been writing, presenting, and publishing on hybrid flexible classrooms since 2006. He edited in 2016, Instructional Design Theories and Models, Volume 4, The Learner-Centered Paradigm of Education, published by Routledge. And most recently, he has written Hybrid Flexible Course Design, published by EdTech. And this is particularly useful for us because it is available online. And so, Dr. Beatty, I just want to say thank you for publishing in such a manner that is available globally for us during this time. We very much appreciate that. And thank you for your time and welcome to Foreman Christian College University.
Thank you, Dr. Trimble. Dr. Beatty, just to say that we're very, very thankful again. And there was lots of excitement after hearing your name, and I realized that lots of our international partners with whom we regularly coordinate our activities, especially in AMICOL, actually a lot of them have registered, but it was a bit too early for them. It's like 5 a.m. But we have like 15 registrations from Cairo University, American University of Armenia, there's Beirut, Bulgaria, Switzerland, John Cabot University, Rome, American University of Paris. And then, of course, there are lots of our own local national universities that have registered and are all have insisted on having a recording if they're not able to join. And so you can see that you're in high demand, and rightfully so. We all know that student engagement is a big issue. This was the shift has been very sudden for us because we are an in-person campus, and shifting to online mode or other modalities like we are doing now in the hybrid of blended format there, where there is in half the cohort of students is in person, the other half is simultaneously being catered to online. And then of course there are asynchronous learners. You, Dr. Beatty, because I've been with you with this sort of model many times, explaining why our faculty are, challenged by so many modalities mixed together, and the perennial issue of student engagement, perseveres throughout. And you well know how difficult it is to involve students, especially in an online format. And then there are other technical challenges which we are not going into right now. So we look forward to your, learning from you on some of the strategies that you might share. I am aware that lots of faculty will have questions to ask. Just for everybody's information, now please write your questions in the chat and we will take them towards the end of the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Brian. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak with faculty and administrators and staff also who are interested in the hybrid, flexible, high flex kinds of course design. We have similar challenges around the world. And so in a sense, it's actually in a good way, I think it's bringing us together a little bit more in this kind of shared experience, as traumatic as it has been. And in education, this has never happened before. Obviously, we have all become online teachers and online students, at least for a period of time. That will probably carry forward for quite a bit of time. So I'm going to speak to you tonight about the hybrid flexible course design, which is our version or our name for a multimodal approach that includes students in the classroom and students in the synchronous, and sometimes students asynchronously or in either or kind of situation. I'm going to share a presentation. This presentation I will also send to you. It's a much longer than we will be covering in the session, but I'm going to try to focus on the things that I think are most top of mind for you, most kind of pressing. But I will reserve at least 15 minutes near the end for questions. But once again, as you go through this in more detail later, if you have other questions about anything that we didn't talk about in particular, I'm happy to engage with you in another dialogue about that, through email or some other means. So that's kind of where we'll go with this. Real briefly, thank you for the introduction, Vice Rector Dr. Trimble. My background is pretty varied. I've been involved in education and training for over 30 years, like perhaps some of you, and I've done technical training, military training, classroom training. I've been a teacher in a high school classroom for 8 years. And I also spent 8 years as our Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs Operations. In that role at the university here, I oversaw all of our academic technology systems, as well as the instructional design support for our faculty. Just last January, I came back to a full-time faculty position because in my heart, I knew I wanted to teach again. And for me, retirement is still far enough away that I could still have a significant impact in the classroom. And so I decided to come back. And the timing happened to be perfect because I got a chance to kind of be in the middle of transitioning to fully online in a campus, much like yours, that's traditionally face-to-face. We have no fully online degree programs, and yet now, obviously, we're all teaching completely online. So it's been a very interesting journey, like as it has been for most of you. Like you mentioned, there is a book out there that's published under a Creative Commons, so it's free for everybody. It's at edtechbooks.org, and a lot of what I talk about is explained in more detail in that volume. Although that volume was produced in October of last year is when we released it, so it's we've added a little bit since then, but there's a lot more that could be written and will be written as we kind of move on, through COVID and beyond. In general, the slides are organized around, an introduction to HyFlex, and I've moved in some engagement strategies and supporting HyFlex students and assessing HyFlex students up a little forward than I usually would, because I know that's what we want to get to. But there's also a lot more information here about supporting students, supporting faculty, and some of the administrative concerns that have to be worked through to do something like this on a large scale, especially for a long term. HyFlex, as you know, is a classroom in a regular classroom and an online classroom of some form that's combined into a single learning community. We really emphasize the fact that we want this to be perceived, the mindset to be, this is a single learning community. It just has multiple participation modes. It's not 2 classes or 3 classes jammed together into a single class. It's a single class, but students are participating differently based on their needs and desires in our situation. The flexibility for us usually is around students being able to choose whether they're online or face-to-face. In the current COVID situation, this flexibility is often much more restricted. When students are only able to come to class, maybe only half the class can be filled with students. Perhaps they have alternate days that they're able to come. And yet we still try to implement the principles, even if we can't provide all the flexibility that we might desire. On our campus, we have a policy, an academic senate policy, that basically lays out what our definition of HyFlex, so that when we use that term with our students and our faculty and our administrators, we all know that this is what we're talking about: an online version, a face-to-face version, together in one course, and students making that choice on a week-to-week basis. Interestingly, on our campus, we have no HyFlex courses right now, because most of our classes are not allowed to meet on campus yet. We will probably be fully online for another full term, and so we hope to return to the classroom at some substantial amount in fall of 21. So now we teach all online. I still try to use the flexibility, so I'm combining synchronous and asynchronous modes and not able to combine the face-to-face modes. In HyFlex, we have 4 key principles that we try to follow whenever we're implementing a HyFlex program or course: alternatives, equivalence, reuse, and accessibility. I'll talk about each of these real briefly. In alternatives, it just basically means that for us to be a HyFlex course, the faculty has to prepare a fully online version and a fully face-to-face version. Sometimes it's synchronous online, sometimes it's asynchronous, sometimes, or in many cases, it's actually both, as the technologies become easier to do both. But that's available, and it's designed ahead of time. So while a course, the first time a course is offered, it may not be fully designed all the way through, but as long as it's available a week or 2 ahead of the students, that might be acceptable in a kind of a crisis situation. When I started teaching again late last January, I wasn't supposed to teach, and I was asked to teach a course for my program, and I had 2 weeks to start teaching, and so I had to create a course from nothing. And so I did not have it completely built out before we started, but as long as I stayed 2 weeks ahead, I was able to meet the needs for students, and it was developed as a HyFlex course. The equivalence means that every mode that we offer has to lead to equivalent learning outcomes. You could use the word equal learning outcomes, but this doesn't mean they're equivalent or identical processes. Clearly, a classroom instructional environment is very different than an asynchronous online instructional environment. And there's even some differences between the classroom environment for a face-to-face student compared to a synchronous student online. But no matter which mode they choose, the activities that we design for them and we facilitate for them and we engage them in should lead to equivalent learning outcomes. So there should be no difference really in the measured student performance. Clearly, the experience in the classroom is different than the experience as an asynchronous student, but that doesn't mean it's any less leading to learning. The learning will have a little different flavor to it, right? Students might their personality fit might be better for a classroom or it might be better for an online place. But the learning that we're programming to get them, the contract we have with them to help them learn and to present a degree should be the same no matter which the mode. The principle of reuse is important, and especially it's important to me because this is how I help manage my own workload. If I build everything once and then reuse that material in all modes of the class, then I don't have to build 2 or 3 different versions of the class. When I'm designing from scratch, I design a fully asynchronous online course. All the materials are asynchronous and available to students. All the activities are designed to support them. There's a lot of discussions that are designed to support them, the engagement. And then I consider how I can use those materials to teach also in the classroom, to teach also with synchronous online students if we're using that technology. So I try to build it once and reuse it in different modes. I also try to have whatever I'm doing with students in the classroom, I try to capture that when it makes sense and present that also to online students, perhaps through a recording, perhaps through artifacts that we create during an activity, so that the things that we're doing in the classroom also become learning opportunities for students in the online environment and vice versa. When we're doing things with students in the online environment, we can have that accessible to our students in the face-to-face environment. Sometimes I'll use the same online activities for all students, even in the class, so that we're all sharing materials. And so we're reusing materials, but we're also using this to support this idea of a single learning community when we're doing the same things, even maybe at different times. The fourth principle is about accessibility, and this is very important to us as well. We want to make sure that all our materials are accessibility according to we have federal and state laws around this, so that people with different abilities, if they cannot hear well or they can't see well, they can still access the information through alternative modes. But it also means that we're working hard to make sure our students are able to access the networks and the technology and those skills that they need to be an effective online learner, or for that matter, an effective face-to-face learner in the classroom. So accessibility is more than just our legal requirements. It also has to do with other things. Also important is for me to acknowledge that there's a lot of other names for approaches like this. I've listed some on the screen. These are names that were in the literature by the end of 2019, last year. Many of these came from their own development efforts. Some of them came from development efforts that I was working with them on, but they all came up with their own name for this. And then there are a lot of other places that do use the term HyFlex, especially these days. Above the line on this slide, these are approaches that, from the way they write about them, they seem to be more supportive of a flexible learning environment where students are free and encouraged to choose. Below the line, it seems like these are designed more for more fixed situations where students are oftentimes they're distant students. So there's really no chance of them being in the classroom, and yet they're able to combine them. So they're more like traditional multimodal approaches where there's not a lot of mixing of the various modes. And any of these, these were all developed as good solutions for a particular set of problems, but they all share a lot of characteristics with the HyFlex approach, the hybrid flexible approach that we talk about. In a typical class that I teach a lot of graduate courses. Our program also offers some undergraduate courses. I haven't taught those yet. But when I have a class under normal circumstances, I usually have 50 to 60% of the students who are in classes who show up for class. We have a regional campus, and so our students are usually within 50 to maybe 60 or 70 miles away. Some of them are traveling that far to actually get to class, and yet we have a traditionally face-to-face kind of culture on our campus. When we offer the online, I have a number of students doing it asynchronously and another number doing it synchronously. And then I encourage them, if they need to make a switch in modes. And so the next time we meet, some of the students from the classroom are now going to be online. Some of the students who were online are now going to be in the classroom. There seems to be always a core group that's always online because they're choosing to be online because they cannot be in class, or they do not have they have a time conflict, and so they have to do it asynchronously. But there are other students who are free to choose, and so they often take advantage of that. For me, at about 10 or 15% of the students were making decisions to choose each week. We have had other campuses, or other courses on campus, oftentimes large undergraduate courses, where there's many more students are online asynchronously than they are in the classroom, right? So the differences are often driven by the engagement of the students in the content. How important is the relationship between the faculty member and the students, the networking on a lot of those other things that students know are better for them, generally speaking, in a face-to-face environment. I do want to quickly, briefly talk about how we design HyFlex, because your institution has been part of designing multiple modes like this, and you've got a great resource I want to make sure everyone is aware of. Essentially, our steps to HyFlex, we start with a strategic decision to do this. I think this is important whenever this is going to be more than just one faculty member deciding to teach this way because they want to serve their students better. For it to have obviously a larger impact, it's usually most impactful at a program level or a department level, or scaling up to a college or school level, and maybe an entire institution. There are some institutions around our country in the United States that I know of that are moving towards creating their entire curriculum following this kind of approach because they want to serve students that way. So the strategic decision is very important because there needs to be resources available for this. There needs to be time for the faculty to build courses or instructional design support to build the courses. There often needs to be some amount of technology addition to most classrooms if you're going to do the synchronous connection well. Those kinds of things are important. So the strategy has to be one that's agreed to if you want to do this at a large scale. Then we talk about content. What kind of content are we going to use? We talk about learning outcomes at the same time. What are the learning outcomes, the student learning outcomes that we can meet? We analyze those to see how well they're likely to be met in all these different modes. We speak about engagement or assessment. How do we assess learning? We talk about engagement methods. How are we going to engage students in all the different modes that we're offering? And then we have to really kind of go through this idea of, okay, well, we've got a great design now. We have a strategic direction. How are we going to get there? How are we going to actually do this in practice? What kind of student supports do we need? What kind of faculty support do we need? What kind of technology support do we need, or skill sets that we have to develop? And then how do we communicate it out to our stakeholders, students, of course, other faculty members, but also our larger community, and perhaps people who may be interested in helping us out with some funding in some ways. So when we talk about any one of these individual areas, essentially, for many of us moving into HyFlex or forms like this, we're starting with a face-to-face classroom that we've been teaching in for a while. We have an excellent classroom approach, right? We're going to assume that, and then we look at how do we translate our outcomes, our content, our assessment, and our engagement into the various online components that we do. How well does the content that I have for the in-class students, how well does that translate online? These days, it probably translates pretty easily. How well do my assessment approaches work with online students? How well do the engagement approaches I use with my classroom students work with online students? And what do I have to do differently to make that work? There's a wonderful resource that your institution has developed and shared. And so I like to use worksheets that help step faculty through this, maybe sometimes working as a group, sometimes with a design team. But think about these various aspects. What are you doing now? Like, for example, what are your learning outcomes or your learning objectives? And then how well can that be met in a face-to-face classroom? How well can that be met in the online synchronous classroom? How well can that be met with asynchronous students? And so there's a Google document that's available that shows, actually, it could probably, at some point, I'll leave the link. The link is here, so you can go to this. But we can look at the objectives, then we can look at the assessment strategies. We can look at the the content that's needed, as well as kind of the engagement approaches that we're planning to take. So this kind of a structured design thinking process is important, I believe. And my background is in instructional design and technology, so it's kind of natural that an instructional designer would be kind of emphasizing this design approach. But I think it helps you think through these. When I work with faculty on this, I'm working with a group now from another institution. Almost all the time, we find that the learning outcomes can be met well in any mode of the teaching. That's not true for every class. There are some classes where individual or group performance in person is really critical to the learning and to the assessment of learning. Some music, dance, some lab classes in the science and technology areas. Oftentimes you need to have a face-to-face component to make that work. And so then we talk about whether or not a full class should be considered HyFlex, or maybe there are elements of the class that can be done with HyFlex, but there may be other elements that have to be scheduled, in a location on campus or in some other place where they can have access to those resources. And so there's often a hybrid approach even to the HyFlex itself. And so, but working through with a design process will basically allow us to identify those needs so that then we can act on them. I want to talk a little bit about the technologies that we use to support HyFlex, because this is also something that's very much one of the initial concerns is, well, will we have the technology to do this? Well, all of our modes need access to the learning management system and related technologies for basic operations these days, when many of our classes are technology mediated, even in the classroom. Access to network and devices, for all of these modes is important. In the classroom, we have to be able to stream audio and video from the class out to a synchronous connection, or maybe to record, if that's going to be part of what we're offering to online students. If students in the online synchronous mode, they need to be able to receive that stream from the class, but they also have to be able to provide, audio and video back into the class. And so students have to be equipped with microphones and a camera so that they can adequately participate in class activities. Now, we don't always require students to have videos on. We often encourage them to, but sometimes we have real concerns, or students have concerns about aspects of their environment, or not wanting their face recorded for some reason. That it's hard to say why, but we do often allow students the opportunity to turn their videos off, even though, well, we think it might be more engaging to have the videos on. But that's often a class by class or institution decision. And then the web conferencing application. When I started this 15 or 20 years ago, well, 17 years ago, I guess, whatever the number is, we didn't have a web conferencing application. And so we didn't have live students online. We had asynchronous online students, and we had students in the classroom. And in order to capture what we had in the classroom, I just took the simplest approach. I had a little digital voice recorder that I would just take out, turn on, and put on the table, and it would record the audio from the entire class pretty clear. And I would just, after class, then add an MP3 file to the learning management system, and I added a discussion component for the online asynchronous students. And all the materials were already there, all the presentations, all the readings, etc. And so we had a good enough online course design to start out with. It was not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but it was good enough to help the students reach those learning outcomes if they needed to do the course in an asynchronous mode. Now we use web conferencing. We have video recordings. We have kind of a much richer technology set to use, but all we needed was that kind of the baseline information presentation and the ability to interact. In the online asynchronous mode, really only the additional thing for students oftentimes is they have to be able to record their own audio and video on their own, and then post that to the learning management system for assessments and other kinds of projects that they're working on. In our class, I teach most of my classes in an active learning classroom. And so we have lots, 6 or 7 tables. Each one has a screen. But the important part of this for HyFlex is a camera mounted in the back wall that allows us to capture a room view from the back, so they can have a view of the entire class with the presentation, typically me as a teacher, in front. Just a simple camera, not very expensive. It's been around for quite a while, as a matter of fact. And so this is, if it's already installed, I try to use it. Our teaching station is just a computer. I can plug in a laptop or a tablet or my cell phone, and then I have one button control for all of the audio visual for the class. And we try to create the same one button control in all of our classrooms, even though not all of our classrooms have the installed cameras. We also have a special microphone arrangement in this class to support active learning. It's just wireless table mics, a little system, also not very expensive, and it works very well for us to capture all of the conversations and all the student voices, even in a class of perhaps 35 students. And we capture that well, and that goes out on the stream for the Zoom students. And it also is recorded for the asynchronous online students. But not always can I teach in the classroom like that. And sometimes the technology, might not be working so well. So I've learned to carry around a spare set of technology. I mean, I have one set of technology just on my laptop. I use just my laptop for these webinars, and the audio is good. This would work well enough for a small group, perhaps a class of 15 or 20 students. You might be able to get by with this at a good enough level. Not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but might be good enough. What I do is I carry an external webcam that I can plug into my USB port. I carry an external conference mic that I can plug into my USB port. And so I can basically bring that with me, and it's ready in case I need it. Or if I'm teaching in a classroom that's not equipped for HyFlex on its own. So very, very low cost materials can actually make this work pretty well. What we found is that the audio from the classroom is critical and the video is nice to have. And so if I had to sacrifice one, I would sacrifice the video so I could have the audio, right? When I talk to students and they give us feedback about what's worked well and what hasn't worked well, almost always the things that aren't working well are either around, it's either around audio or group projects, or not getting feedback fast enough from a faculty member, surprisingly enough, just like they would talk about in a regular class. Some places are using cameras like this, the 360-degree camera. This is a Meeting Owl. Also not very expensive, more expensive. I don't carry one of these around. I don't want to have that kind of, that kind of value in my teaching bag that I carry on the train. So other places have gone very much more high technology. And so there's some examples around the world, and a few of these are highlighted in our case studies in the book. This one happens to be in Belgium, and it's a Masters of Teaching program. And so what they do is they have larger screens mounted at the back of the class, and they do this so that the experience for the faculty member and then translating to the students is more like a regular class. And so the interaction is more natural between the faculty member and the students, who are large screens represented in the back of the room. So it's easier for the faculty member to, one, see that they're there and remember that they're there, and then interact with them. It's not impossible to do the interaction with, small screens, little Zoom windows, and maybe even present it backwards, but the faculty member does have to pay attention to them as if they were students in the classroom. Okay, so that is I think one of the big challenges. There was also been a lot of work done in Australia, the blended synchronous learning movement. This was a pretty significant research project, multi-year project, that has developed a handbook for how to do blended synchronous learning, which essentially this is primarily blended synchronous learning. They may have asynchronous students as well, but it's designed for the synchronous environment. So this casebook has, this handbook has case studies that you can take a look at. Once again, I believe it's published under Creative Commons, so it's free for everyone. It's a great resource if you're interested in taking a look at that. Another resource I'll share quickly about spaces is this space called FlexSpace. It's flexspace.org, and it's basically a database of lots of different teaching spaces that institutions around, really around the world, mostly probably from North America right now. But what they do is they contribute their spaces to explain what they do and why they do them. It's expanded this last year into including physical distance spaces as well as some high flex spaces. And so if you go to flexspace.org, you can sign up for a free account. It's, they don't market you anything. They don't sell you anything. They just give you access to the system, and you can actually ask questions. There are contact people for all of these spaces, and there are literally hundreds of different institutions are sharing their spaces. Another part of the student experience for this is to make sure that students know what they're getting into. Institutions that do this more broadly than we do typically have a website set up for this. What is a high flex course, or whatever they want to call it? In my situation, when I was department chair, I had that kind of website for my department. The department, when I went to be an AVP, the department was absorbed into a larger department, and you may know departmental politics. We lost control of the website, and so that larger explanation isn't there anymore. I'm working slowly to kind of rebuild that. But what I found is that the students don't really understand what a high flex course is until they've taken one, right? And once they've taken one, when they show up for the first time in the class, or they enroll in a class and I send them an initial email welcoming them to the class and explaining things, that's when they start to get the idea, oh, I can take this online, or I can take it face to face. That's a great thing for me. And that's when they start appreciating that. So, but communicating to the students is important. One of the institutions that does this almost across the board for the curriculum is Pierce College. This is in Philadelphia in the United States. They've been doing this. They call their approach Pierce Fit. They've been doing this for about 5 years now. And so they have an entire website, or part of their website, set up to explain to their students, but also to the people who are in the community who might be students in the future. They do this for marketing, right? They're doing it to serve students online and face-to-face who are still local students, but who are too busy to actually come to campus to attend classes in person. Another university that I worked with this summer, this is a brand new approach for them. This is Shenandoah University, also here in the United States, but they created an approach. They call it ShenFlex to brand it for them for locally, but they've also got their own website, part of their website, to explain to students what it is they're offering. Because they're, once again, they're not only are they better serving students, but they also want to market this as an advantage for students who choose to come to this institution. So that's one of the reasons that other institutions do this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, more specifically, about engaging students in HyFlex classes. We'll probably for about 10 more minutes, and then we'll start answering questions. When we talk about supporting students learning, I think of it as like a three-legged stool here, where we've got content, assessment, and engagement. All right, all of these are important, and if any one of these is weak, then obviously the student learning outcomes may not be met as well as they could be. So engagement's important, not just in the online environment, not just in the synchronous environment, but also in the classroom environment. So as we think about engagement, oftentimes the challenge for faculty is engaging in the online space. If we are a seasoned, someone who's been around for a while teaching in the classroom, we have engagement strategies that probably work pretty well. At least that's the assumption we'll make. So the real challenge, and kind of sometimes the fear, is, how do I engage students online? I've heard all these horror stories about students in online courses who will never reply to anything, and they won't participate in discussions. How do we do this? Can I do this? Will my students actually interact? So when we start talking about this, first we kind of go through the why. All right, what are we trying to do, and why are we trying to do it? So different types of engagement are important to support student learning. The students need to be able to interact clearly with the content, right? That's kind of the core thing, is to support learning outcomes. But we also need the students to be able to interact with the instructor, because that helps form a professional relationship. And many students are motivated or demotivated by that relationship. So if we can have them interacting in constructive ways, that we're more likely to have a positive relationship there. And we also often want students to interact with other students. So student-to-student interaction is also critical. We know that, in a lot of the things that we're trying to teach, they're developing their understanding through engagement with others. And sometimes those others, and often most importantly, or at least as importantly as anything else, is their interaction with other students. Another concept that we will briefly talk about is this idea of presence. This is from the community of inquiry literature that was designed specifically to support well-designed online asynchronous courses that relied primarily on text, right, for interaction. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but these certainly relate to the whole idea of HyFlex as well, because we want to make sure that the online environment for students has the social presence like it would in the classroom. It won't be the same, but we have to be able to address that, the need for that social, the fact that the feeling that I'm not the only person out here, there are other people learning with me, and there's a teacher there, so there's a teaching presence, and there's information to be learned, and applications to learn how to do, and that's the cognitive presence piece. All of these contribute to the learning experience, and so it's important that as we're designing, we design elements that support each one of these. We can tie these together pretty simply and say, well, the social presence is primarily the student-to-student interaction, although there is often the element of the social presence of the teacher associated with the teaching presence. And then there's the idea of the cognitive presence, where there's structured information, there's information that's important for me to learn, and there are applications that I need to learn how to do. And so this all works together to support the educational experience. I'm not going to go through the specific presences now, but because you can look at that later, and I want to talk real briefly about connections among students. There are certain specific things I do in my classes now, and my approach for HyFlex has changed a bit over the 15 years I've done it. I add a lot more video and audio now because it's easier for me to capture, and I encourage students to do the same thing. Sometimes I'll add it to an assignment. Sometimes I'll just make it an option for them. So instead of just a text-based forum, oftentimes now we're using video or audio files as well. And so that makes it a little bit richer experience. We're also sometimes using other technologies. But when I'm doing the things for students, I want to have them all doing some of the same things, this idea of a shared experience, creating a learning community every week. And so I create 2 forums every week that all students have to participate in, whether they're in class or they're online synchronous or they're online asynchronous. One of them is just a reflection post about how they're learning. This is more of a kind of a metacognitive formative assessment approach I use, that I want them to tell me what their learning process has been like this last week. It does not have to be a long post. 100 words is probably plenty. It does not have to be focused on the content, what they're learning. although they'll often talk about what they're learning. I want to know what their process has been. Are they making progress? Do they feel like they're making progress? Are they finding something challenging? Are they frustrated with something that's going on associated with the course? These are open, this is like an open journal for them. So in my course, they each start a thread the first week of the class, and then every week they reply back to it. So after the 15 weeks of our term, they've got 15 different posts all connected in one thread that are basically mapping their learning journey from like an effective perspective. I tell them I read them all. I tell them other students can read them. They're not required to. What I find is after 2 or 3 weeks, most students are reading other people's posts, and many students are actually replying to them. So it basically is a community formation tool that I'm not forcing on them. All I do is tell them, put your ideas down there and let's see what happens, essentially. The other thing I do is with my class discussions that are focused more on the content, I used to just have those for the asynchronous students, and then the face-to-face students, we would do all of our discussions in class. What I found is that with smaller numbers of asynchronous students, that online discussion was very weak. It was more of a dialogue between each of them and me as I replied to their posts. And that wasn't really an effective discussion. So now what I do is I require all of the students to be part of the asynchronous discussions, even if they're coming to the classroom. It makes it a richer discussion. We can do a lot more with that discussion, and it creates more of a sense of community because now we're all in the same discussion space sharing those ideas every week. That was a powerful change that I made. And I don't know why it took me that long to do it. So what I think one of the challenge was, well, am I overloading my students who are coming to class? Because I want them to talk in class and I want them to talk online. And so now what I do is I reduce their work in class a little bit. And actually, I'll probably give them 30 minutes of class time. They can sit in class and do their post right then, or they can leave and do the post at their own time. And so that's essentially how I have kind of made that, in my mind, at least fair. Which brings up another interesting point. When you're creating different ways of interacting with students, different engagement approaches with students in the various modes, you're going to also have them doing different activities, similar, but they're going to have a little bit different form to them. It's important to make sure that you're not overloading a certain type of student. Saying, oh, asynchronous students, well, read this, watch this video, create this post, you do this other kind of thing, and kind of do these other kinds of things, when that might be a lot more work than you're actually asking your in-class students to do. And so it's important to keep track of kind of the rigor or the effort you're requiring, maybe the time that you're expecting from each of these students. And if we don't consciously pay attention to that, it can easily, get out of whack. I want to move forward. You can look more about this classroom engagement piece. I do want to show you one thing. There's a really interesting resource. You may have come across this, but this is from Vanderbilt University, posted in June. And the concern was, well, how do we create active learning? How do we support active learning in a hybrid and socially distanced classroom, which many of us are finding. If we're able to bring students back, it's not the same classroom as it was before. There are some very important differences. And so this blog post that they put together went through roughly 10 different ways that we often do active learning in the classroom, and says, well, here's how we think you could do this with students, even if they're in masks, even if you're 6 feet apart and not able to move around, as well as working with students who are online synchronous at the same time. So that might be a useful resource for you to take a look at. As well, Louisiana State University created a nice framework. Once again, you may have come across this, but essentially they're doing a similar thing. What are the active learning activities we traditionally do in classes? And what is the online equivalent for synchronous students? What would be an online version of this for asynchronous students? And then how about the physically distanced classroom? We can't assume that we're always going to have the same classroom that we had before, even when we get back into the classroom for us. And so this is also linked. This is a Google Doc, and they're asking for your feedback and your contributions as well. I want to honor our commitment to answer questions in the chat. So if there are questions, I'm happy to follow those directions. And if there are no questions, then what I'll do is I'll continue talking about some assessment aspects of this.
Yeah, Brian, I don't think we have any questions so far. So I would like us to continue what you're talking about right now, because this directly affects, the challenges our faculty are facing. So I think these are great resources. And if you could sort of elaborate a few more similar ones.
Right. Okay, I'll continue to go with that. I will say that when you have questions about trying to do things online, or even high flex in your discipline, or in your particular area, one of the great resources you have, or at least many of us have, is a professional organization, with people in your local area, but also probably around the world, who are doing some of this. Every discipline has got somebody who's doing something like hybrid flexible at this point in time. And so that is one good resource to look at, as well as it's a place that if you do this, it's a way of doing production, professional work, to publish in your domain, to explain to them, well, here's how you can do a multimodality class in whatever it happens to be, engineering, or nursing, or a language of some sort. All right, so there are more resources here about assessing, discussions. This is from DePaul University. There are lots of resources like this. These are a few that I found that to be very useful. I do want to talk a little bit about assessment, because I know that's an important aspect for this. I'll also, this is a book that's also available. You can buy this book, but you can also get PDF versions of the chapters. This is from Kurt Bonk in Indiana and his colleague, and they've been very gracious to make it available in PDF form as well. Each one of these chapters talks about a different aspect of using some variety with technology in your online classes. And of course, that also then will apply for a HyFlex or multimodal course. Chapters 10 and 11 seem to be, or what interactivity and engagement chapters, or principles 7 and 8, chapters 10 and 11, I think. Those are the ones I always have my students read. Another resource is about managing large classes. For some of us who are teaching very large classes, not me, but some of my colleagues do, these are really critical resources, because those classes are not going to get any smaller when we get back to the classroom. Assessing learning is obviously a critical topic. A couple of principles about assessing learning. We'll see how much of this we can kind of cover. And the presentation will be available, obviously, afterwards. So I think consistency is very important. So when we have students working in different modes, we're used to using a classroom-based test with our students. Oftentimes, if we're doing an asynchronous version of the course, that test will obviously be asynchronous and it'll be online. I think it's important for us to use the same format of test, if we can, for all of the students in the class, for a couple of reasons. One, because it simplifies it for you as the instructor or the designer. And it also probably levels the playing field for the students. If a student thinks that taking a test online is easier than taking a test in the classroom, or vice versa, then that's likely going to drive some of their decisions about how they're going to participate in class, if they have that choice. Okay. If I have students in the classroom and I have students working asynchronously online and I'm doing a test, I will give them the exact same online test. At least it'll be the same test that they're accessing. I will try to randomize questions. I will randomize answers. I will design the test so that it can be done well by an asynchronous student and isn't so easy to cheat on that I have to be too concerned about that. But then I'll use that same test with students in class, and they'll have to bring technology, or we'll provide technology for them to take the test in class. Okay, that gives them more of an even playing field, or more equitable is probably the better term to use for these. So using the same testing environments, I think, is important. If we're doing testing, then the question always comes up, do we need proctoring? There are some institutions that won't allow proctoring at all, even in a face-to-face test, because they have an honor code that they want students to know that they actually trust them to hold to. And so some of them will tell the faculty, if you're doing a test, you cannot be in the room. You just give the students your test and you wait outside the door until they're finished. I've only heard of 1 or 2 institutions that do that. For many of us, the faculty member can do the proctoring, and even in an online environment, sometimes the faculty member will do the proctoring. But sometimes for high stakes tests or certification exams, they might require to have a third-party vendor or a third-party solution, which actually is using a camera, using microphones, and sometimes using multiple cameras to make sure the student is not cheating on the test, at least not in a way that's easy to find. Different institutions will have different policies around that. Our institution, we just passed a Senate policy that says we are not going to use third-party proctoring for classes that are using tests. It's only going to be used if needed for like a certification or an accreditation kind of exam. That's where we don't really have where we really can't say no to it, because we have some concerns about those. So one of the things that we try to do with faculty who are using these tests is to make sure that they're trying to create a test that is more cheating proof in the sense that it's harder for students to find value in cheating. Students cheat. Unfortunately, this happens in almost every place. Not every student, clearly. Probably most students aren't, wouldn't do this, but many do. And so we have to acknowledge it. If we're going to use these tests to decide how well students are learning, and that decision matters, then I think we have to do our due diligence in trying to make it more difficult for students to kind of cheat on this. And so part of the things that we can use to change this are shifting to lower stakes testing, right? Instead of having a midterm and a final, 30%, 70% of a grade, which is sometimes done, maybe we do more tests that are less valued, or we do quizzes along the way, or we build a course grade that includes participation and homework assignments and other kinds of things, not just these 2 tests. Other things that we'll do sometimes is we'll look for authentic assessments, which would be assessments that aren't really test driven, but are more project based or paper based, or where people are trying to do things, or we're trying to assign activities to students that are more like the domain in which we're trying to teach them. So for example, in my field of instructional design, I have projects that students do, instructional projects. They're building projects for the entire term. And I give them feedback along the way. So at the end of the term, they have something that goes in their portfolio. That's not that difficult to do in many cases, although there are a lot of domains where you do need to have a regular pattern of getting feedback on what people learned. Like I used to teach math, I used to teach physics. In both of those situations, I always use tests and quizzes, but I try to de-emphasize the final and make things a little less likely that students would be feeling this pressure to cheat because they were afraid of a poor score. There's a resource, another resource that was developed in the spring. This one is Vedamicum. I'm not sure exactly how to say that. I've said it a few times and I never gotten it right. For the remote assessment of students, I think it's from our colleagues in Switzerland who created this. And if you open this PDF up, it does a nice job of kind of creating a table of different forms of assessment: individuals, groups, online, face-to-face, synchronous, etc., and gives you some guidance on how to choose, kind of a network of assessments, not just tests, but a variety of things that you might be able to use to kind of better assess your students in the online environment in particular. And my like I said earlier, what I prefer to do is to kind of make sure I'm designing for the online and then using the same or very similar things with my face-to-face students. And there's also some good resources here that talk about cheating. James Lang has been writing about this, and there's a nice book out as well, but there's a lot of resources and once it had a lot of, kind of podcast airtime as well around these. So that can be useful as well. There's another resource here that I'd like to point people to. This is at my alma mater, Indiana University, and they do a very good job of explaining authentic assessment and giving lots of examples of the ways you might rethink about your assessment that might allow you to avoid the challenge with assessment and the challenge of cheating on tests. So these are some of the aspects about authentic assessment, right? I don't think this is probably brand new to anyone. One of the the difficulties with moving from a kind of especially an online kind of testing and quizzing format to a authentic assessment approach, where you're doing projects and things like that, is oftentimes those LMS tests, they grade themselves pretty much, right? The quizzes, student pushes submit, and 20 milliseconds later, the grade is there, and you can choose to show that to them or not. But the grading part of it is really has not, it takes away that workload from the faculty. For authentic assessments, you don't have that opportunity. I don't know of a single, there are probably people working on some AI solutions, artificial intelligence to actually do this, but I don't think we're ever going to get there, quite honestly, probably not before I retire at least. So we often use things like rubrics. You can use different kinds of rubrics, an analytical rubric that has, multiple aspects and multiple different scores for various qualities of those aspects. A holistic rubric that just kind of shows you, these are the 5 things I'm looking for. And then I look at those 5, or there's something that is called a single point rubric, which is actually faster to use generally. And it basically lists all the different aspects I care about in this work, and then my expectations, and it just does that in a single column on the screen. And then on the right side, I would write positive comments. On the left side, I would write negative comments. And it's a way for me to use the same idea of a rubric that does a nice idea of structuring my feedback to students, but still gives me the freedom to write in the comments that I need to give students to give them that feedback. The feedback is critical. And students, one of their number one complaints about online courses, whenever we've asked them, is that I don't get feedback from my faculty, and that's it's either that or, they assign us these discussions and they're never there, right? They're never posting anything. And so those are things that, are the biggest things I find that get in the way of quality online education. And in that sense, quality HyFlex education is when faculty themselves aren't engaged, either because they don't know how to engage, or they're not making the time to be engaged, or they haven't counted the cost ahead of time so they can schedule time for engagement into their calendar. Engaged students begin with engaged faculty, right? So if your faculty aren't willing to be engaged, you can't expect your students to be willing to be engaged, right? And if you find your students aren't engaged, the first thing to check, I think, is am I engaging in ways that are meaningful to the students? Or is there something I can do differently that would attract more engagement from the students? Sometimes what I try to do is enlist students, like student collaborators, in trying to fix this engagement problem. Have students facilitate online discussions, have students come up with the prompts for discussions, maybe not all the time, but at least some of the time, so that they feel more ownership over this activity. Explain to students why this is important. Or have discussions. The other thing I've done is I've done discussions that if a student is participating in the discussion, they're actually building part of their next assignment. They may not realize that the first time, but by the time they see, oh, this assignment, we just did that in the discussion. I wish I had done a better job on that discussion. Well, the next time that comes around, they're putting more effort into the discussion because they know it's likely to show up as another assignment coming through. Okay, I think we're almost out of time. Are there any questions, any single questions you might have come across here?
Thank you, Brian. This is a very comprehensive, and I have a lot of takeaways which I'll sort of encapsulate right now. But there is one question there were some smaller ones that I responded while you were talking, but they were related to some of your text. But there's one from Dr. Wasim Anwar. Dr. Brian, do you have any specific tip for discipline-based interaction for an English class? Because he's an English humanities faculty, senior faculty. So I wonder if you understand discipline-based interaction. So
yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think what has worked well for us is that when we have people working in different disciplines and they come to us with questions, the first thing we do is we look to see what resources already exist that basically tell the story of that discipline in this particular mode. And it's usually for online learning. And so the first thing I would look for is online English courses where people have already solved this problem. It may not be a solution that works exactly for me, but it gives me a starting point. And for that, on our campus, we look at our own faculty first, or faculty at other campuses that we may have relationship with, because it's easier then, perhaps. But then might look in a kind of a regional association for that. If a class, if there's a value in discussion, well, then there's a lot of information out there on how to do effective online discussions. If there are specific activities that you're looking for in a particular field, the first thing I consider is, well, what am I doing in the classroom? And can I translate to online? If it works in the classroom, it might very well work online, or it might maybe it needs to be some more technology mediation or things like that. There might be some shift in that. But there's a lot that we do in the classroom that we can also do well online. And so those would be the first things I would look for. And then I would start searching the literature, because we've been doing online education for 3 decades now, using the internet, almost 3 decades, I guess. And so there are a lot of good practices out there. And like I said, none of them would be the best for me because I'm my own teacher, right? But a lot of them will help me get to that point where, oh, I can use 90% of this, and I can change the other 10%. That's probably the best answer I can do to kind of address that across all disciplines. Even when I get questions about how do I teach music online? How do I teach art online? Well, the first thing I'll say is, well, are there any fully online art programs that teach courses like these? And if the answer is yes, then I say, well, let's take a look at those. Maybe we can talk to someone who teaches in those programs, and they oftentimes are very willing to share what they're doing. and we can find out what they're doing and decide whether or not that kind of approach might work for us.
Thank you, Brian. I think the point that we have understood, and there's actually an observation from one of the faculty, that what you're talking about is talking about a systemic change to a hybrid and an online environment. And unfortunately, you had that, option at your campus, but unfortunately, we did it in more like an emergency mode to remote instruction. And now due to the uncertainty, we are continuing with that situation. And our faculty are hoping to go back to the in-person on-campus mode. And to be very frank, Brian, our campus is not equipped to tackle the online modality to the level that you talked about some things, and I don't think they are in our classroom. So all our faculty are dealing with is a laptop and deal with an in-person and online learner at the same time. And I am sure a lot of engagement interaction issues arise out of that lack of technical lag in the two learners, they have to face with that. But I think, having said that, a lot of, you made my job as CLT remarkably easy. You have put up beautiful resources that I will look into, and I will try to make them, more suitable for faculty with the temporary modality in mind, that this is a temporary modality and that we are not right now going into it. But your takeaway is that some things that, if I may summarize, you gave an overview of the HyFlex model. That was nice to know and understand how is it different from our own model. You also then went on to the principles that you cited. I think they apply equally to all modalities, blended or hybrid or whatever you call it, those for online teaching and so on. Those 4 principles that you cited are key to take anything forward and to keep the fitness of the program. And then you talked about what you said in the end is to engage your students no matter what. You have to be engaged. I think that was a great takeaway. And then you talked about how to increase presence, how to develop community with students. And I think another point that you made somewhere along the line was giving students a stake in their own learning, sort of making them partners in pedagogy. So I think those were 3 remarkable takeaways that come to my point as I, go back and, and the one most important thing I think that I learned was that you develop for an asynchronous mode course design and then translate it rather than design for in-person and then try to translate. I think that was something that I haven't thought about, and I think we haven't registered that in offering that suggestion to our faculty. I think it's remarkable. But right now, what we have done is we have translated our in-person on-campus courses to the other 2 modes. And that is why the faculty have a lot of load. But remarkable learning. I wish I'd got you much earlier before the session and had some, this talk with you and with our faculty a bit earlier. But I think we intend to perhaps go into a spring, perhaps pretty much like this. And your tips and your resources will be very, very handy and very helpful. We had some, 82 participants to the very end, which is one of the best figures that we have had so far. And just to repeat that lots of our foreign international faculty have requested for your recording as well. So it's again an honor to have you to give us the time. And we're very happy too that you could find the time. And good night, Dr. Brian Beatty.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you
good
so
day.
much. Yeah. Bye-bye. For the rest of us, I will be sending you the presentation. We'll be sending you the link of the recording. And I think we'll be able to use some of these resources, and we'll try to, like I said, make them more comfortable. I'll do a brief of the session and send it out to you as well, so that you can, the takeaways are what you remember and sort of can use for your work. If there's anything you would like us to do at CLT, we are very happy to do that for you. So all the best, and do fill in the feedback form and do write some of the things that you would like to know more about so we can make our offerings more helpful to you. Thank you, Dr. Trimble. Thank you so much for doing the welcome. It made my job easy. So thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for organizing this with an
Thank you.
international expert. This was really helpful. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. Thank you. I really enjoyed it listening to him. There were lots of nice things he said. Okay, dears. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.